when we organized this sequence of events, we definitely wanted to start it off with a keynote from Adrienne Héritier, because Adrienne has done so much to shape the way we understand the European project. She's been such a powerful influence in our lives professionally as the head of the European Union Studies Association, but also academically, and indeed as a mentor to many of us at different stages in our career. So that was a wonderful way for us to get started. What we planned to do at the end, so our last event, is to take us out of our comfort zones a bit, to think about things differently, to imagine a new research agenda. And so we brought the most terrifying academic we could find. Luiza Bialasiewicz is a political geographer who trained at the University of Boulder. She's worked at Durham and Royal Holloway before going to the University of Amsterdam. At Amsterdam, she ran the Amsterdam Centre for European Studies, and we met many times in that context. And she is, in many ways, an iconoclastic voice in the political science community, but speaking from a tradition that we have not embraced fully over the past few decades, but that we must learn to embrace looking ahead. And I think, alas, the fact that we are re-embracing geography and the study of geography says a lot about where world order is going, but it also says a lot about where our intellectual journeys should take us. I started out our conversation talking a bit about the importance of vision, but in order to have vision, you have to have an imaginary. And so it is with great pleasure that I ask Luiza to speak to us a bit about the imagined geographies of European crises. She'll talk for about 45 minutes. We'll have question and answer. After that, for some reason, they've given us 15 minutes to close. I'm not sure what we have to do in closing for 15 minutes, but we'll figure that out when we get there. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll go back to the lower loggia in order to have lunch, okay? Please join me in welcoming Luiza Bialasiewicz.
Thanks so much. And after that introduction, now I'm really terrified because I have to somehow live up to it and, you know, kind of represent all of geography apparently as well. So this is going to be a hard task. So I wanted to talk to you, in fact, about imagined geographies. And especially, in a sense, kind of linking back to the last conversation, their effects on European politics, and especially on various forms of backlash. Backlash against climate policy, against migration policy, against economic policy, economic restructuring. This cartoon is stolen from The New Yorker from about 10 days ago, and I thought it captured this sense of, to me at least, not just a kind of preoccupation, but trying to make sense of this shift to the right. So what do I mean? What am I going to talk about when I talk about imagined geographies? I'm assuming there are no geographers in the room. Are there? So I can tell you anything, basically, at this point, right? The way geographers like to start their introductory human geography courses is by asking students where the term comes from. Where does geographia from the Greek comes from? Anyone? Very direct. It's literally the writing of the earth. It's the writing of worlds, right? So the way in which we describe not just the world out there, but the world around us, and the way we make sense of it through spatial, through geographical representations. And so one of the things that geographers like to argue is that geography is as much about maps of meaning as it is about maps of states. It's not just, you know, kind of the contours of frontiers. And so what I want to talk about today is the way in which we tell geographical, spatial stories about the world, about the changes that are happening in the world, because they're also always stories about us and them, about self and other, about security, about danger, but also about blame and responsibility, and I will focus on those last two. And what I will try to bring into the conversation, in a sense, to follow up on the discussions that you've been having in the workshops, is some work, yes, from geography, but also from anthropology that I think can be very useful in understanding the various forms of backlash, and again, the way in which European citizens have made sense or tried to make sense of the various crises. One more thing to add to this, also from a geographical perspective, one of the other things that geographers love to repeat is that all geographical metaphors, all geographical representations are always both description and prescription. There's a great Italian geographer, Giuseppe De Matteis, who works in Torino for many years, who wrote extensively about this. He's got this great book for those of you who read Italian, which is called Le Metafore della Terra, that talks exactly about the power of geographical imaginations. What do I mean by this? So when we offer a particular spatial representation, it's not just a description of what is out there. It also presumes within it to tell us the way things should be, not just the way they are. And again, this is a very important part of it. As part of that also prescriptive nature of all spatial representations, there's an inherent, we could call, normative aspect, very often ethical aspect. Some colleagues talk about, specifically moral geographies, especially as related to the ways in which we make sense of crisis. Another person who's written about this extensively with regards to political economies, somebody who's a sociologist, but that geographers like to claim as their own, who is Bob Jessup, whose work is wonderful if you don't know it. I strongly would encourage you to read it. And Jessup wrote not specifically about imagined geographies, but what he termed imagined cultural political economies that are very powerful, important in occluding both the longer histories as well as the geographies of existing contemporary economic divides. I will also bring to it, as I just mentioned, work from anthropology, both on affective economies, but also the sort of emotional excess, including fear, and the role of specific objects, the role of material objects in trying to make sense, again, of a world in crisis, of a world in change. One, place to start, to kind of tie it to some of the discussions that have been taking place here, is, I kind of dipped my foot, my nose into several of the workshop sessions. And I think most of the discussion, again, the one that I was able to listen to, focused on institutional elite understandings of crisis, the way in which European institutions, European actors have tried to manage crisis, have tried to make sense of crisis. There's a huge bundle of work in geography that looks at this. I don't want to particularly look at this because I want to look at the backlash side. I want to look at the way in which European citizens have made sense of it. But if I can, again, recommend some of this work, Greek economic geographer Kostis Hadjimichalis, who's done wonderful work precisely on these mental mappings of crisis and how European actors, European institutions specifically, have worked with very concrete spatial imaginations that have also structured responses. But as I said, that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is geographical sense-making in everyday by European citizens, and especially try to understand how various European crises, but also global crises, because when we're talking about migration or climate change, I think it's very problematic to consider it a European crisis. How these different crises touch down in people's everyday lives and are made sense of. So there's, again, a large body of work in political geography, specifically in feminist political geography, looking at everyday fears, looking at the ways in which big geopolitics touches down and how these big fears somehow, as Rachel Payne and Susan Smith write, how do these big insecurities worm their way into our everyday lives? And what do people do with them? So they started writing, I mean, you can see this is a piece from 2008. They started writing about this in the years of the War on Terror, thinking about how the effects of the War on Terror were perceived. I mean, they were writing from the UK context, but how, fears surrounding terrorism, but also fears surrounding state surveillance were being experienced in very different ways in people's everyday lives. And so this is where I would like to start. So from this perspective, thinking about how people make sense of these big crises by putting these fears, putting concerns literally in their place, in people's specific everyday environments. And as they write, and I think, I love this, the way they visualize it, fears do not just pop out of the heavens and hover in the ether before blanketing, themselves along across huge segments of cities and societies. These fears have to be lived, they have to be made, they have to be played, replayed, revisited, and reconstituted on a daily basis. So certainly there is the role of the state, the national state, the local state, but also other forms of reproduction, of kind of feeling the fears and making the fear real. But also one of the other questions that they're asking is, how do processes, people, but also objects become feared? How do they become fearful? I'll throw another kind of set of literatures here at you before I come to some examples. And this comes largely from anthropology and from feminist studies. First, the work of Sara Ahmed, which many of you will know, who talks about the effective economies that determine, also historically, right, to what and to whom feelings, fearful feelings, stick. Who is to be feared? Which bodies in which spaces? And certainly there's a lot of research on migration in European cities, but not only, how certain migrant bodies become objects of fear and how this can also change through time. If we think of the 2015-2016 crisis, that many scholars will insist on calling a hospitality crisis rather than a refugee crisis. If you think how public fears and the ways in which they were presented by the media shifted from the first months when, this was really a question of, kind of collapse of the external borders, inability to manage these flows, and a concern perhaps with being able to understand, who was it that was coming in. Think about how the debate and the fears, certainly in the public imaginary, shift after the events on New Year's Eve in Cologne and other European cities, where suddenly those arriving were not just possibly a terrorist threat, a threat to European public order, but they became represented as a threat to European women, right? To the bodies of European women on European streets. Very same migration wave as it may be, but that becomes transformed in the public imaginary. And so the work of Ahmed and other anthropologists looking at this, talks about, the importance of these effective economies and how they are built, how they stick to particular, again, bodies and objects, and also in particular spaces. And this notion of emotion, of excess, I think is really important in understanding contemporary backlash, if that's what we want to call it, in contemporary, not just radical politics, because I think, and I will insist on this, it's very easy to consign these excess emotions to the far right as we've seen, not just in the last European elections, in most recent national elections, the far right is not that far anymore, and many of its tropes, many of its ideas have been directly taken up by center, not just center-right politicians. But I think, once more, looking at what's behind these things, so just going beyond the emotion, is very important. I'm not going to dwell here because I want to add one more thing to it, because it helps us understand why certain objects in these political narratives of backlash take on importance. And here, the notion of fetish, and Eric, you gave me, I'll use a football term, a really good assist with your mention of fairy tales. So I'm not going to talk to you about fairy tales, but I will talk to you about, fetish objects and other kind of notions from cultural anthropology that are, I think, very useful to apply also to contemporary European politics. We tend to apply them, to far-off societies. No, actually, they work quite well here. So the quote that you see here comes from French anthropologist Emmanuel Tréret, writing in 2004 in an essay on New Left Review. He's actually quoting from Istvan Bibo, writing about interwar Europe. And I think it's a very useful kind of approach to understanding how people make sense, again, of a rapidly changing world that they cannot grasp, that they don't really have not just the conceptual, but the political tools to deal with. And this is what Théret writes. When a community fails to find within itself the means or the energy to deal with a problem that challenges, if not its existence, then at least its way of being and self-image, it may be tempted to adopt a peculiar defensive ploy. It will substitute a fictional problem, which can be mediated purely through words and symbols, for a real one, which it finds insurmountable. In grappling with the former, the community can convince itself that it has successfully confronted the latter. It experiences a sense of relief and thus feels itself able to carry on as before. The title of Théret's essay was Headscarf Hysteria, looking at the way the headscarf, the hijab, became this fetish object for a much wider sense of unease about Muslim presence in European cities and in European societies. So the obsession with regulating the headscarf and other external kind of manifestations of Muslim religiosity became this ideal fetish object that allowed societies to deal with it, or at least pretend to. I'll give you another example. Actually, this is from work that I've done with a colleague who, apart from being an academic, was also the former curator of Istanbul Modern Art Museum. And we looked at the ways not headscarves, but rugs, oriental rugs, prayer carpets, became suddenly objects of fear, precisely because they signified Muslim presence, unwanted Muslim presence. And one of the things we wanted to do, and this image is in honor of my new to-be academic home, because it comes from Lorenzo Lotto, the Venetian painter of the 1500s. What happened to make oriental carpets, such as this carpet? And this is a classic, they're called keyhole carpet, that, are where and are used as prayer rugs. What happened for these carpets to become not just objects of fascination, a marker of wealth, of status, make them into objects of fear, of something that should somehow certainly not be present in European cities? And we worked with a number of artists who've attempted interventions, kind of to bring these fetish objects into European cities. This is the work of a Croatian artist called Igor Grubic, who a few years ago went to Modica in Sicily, that had and actually has today an important Muslim community. And what he did was essentially place these rugs in public spaces. This is one picture, I'll show you another one. watching kind of the reactions that these provoked as objects out of place, and that, certainly did not belong. So it's this idea of, what is in place, what is out of place, but especially this focus, whether it's on the headscarf or on the rug, as something, that gathers into it much wider fears, and, as Grubic very nicely pointed out. But I will mention another example here, thinking of fetish objects and thinking of the backlash against the European Green Deal. And it's insects, or crickets specifically, poor crickets. So this is from an Instagram post of Atreo that I don't know, some of the Italians in the room will probably be familiar with it. This is I would consider them extreme right, far right youth organization that Giorgia Meloni was very active in starting up. Their last Congress featured none other than Elon Musk and other prominent global figures. Very, very active, increasingly active in shaping discussions, again, not just within the far right bubble, but beyond. And the title here says, I had a nightmare, back to your, kind of fairy tales. Fried insects have substituted, kind of a frittura di pesce. So, we're all going to be forced to eat fried bugs if you don't vote, in this case, for Meloni. The bug thing, I thought I'd bring in a US example, is not just constrained to Atreo and to Italy. Kind of this idea of, elites forcing us to eat bugs is very much part of the kind of imaginaries of what everyday folks are being forced to do by the global elites who don't care. They fly in their private jets but are forcing us to eat bugs. And I think it's important to take these, we could call them again fetish objects, seriously. It's very easy to laugh them off, but that's precisely the problem. Because then, you lapse into the kind of moralizing that these narratives, kind of take a stab of. So back again to geographical imaginations, which try to help us navigate, these moments of what my colleague Gerard Hall calls moments of geopolitical vertigo. They're moments of economic vertigo, climate change vertigo. But this idea of finding stories, finding narratives that help us make sense of this changing world, and especially its iniquities. And I think there is the other important part, right? How do we make sense of real divides or perceived divides? And it's actually the same thing, as you well know. So from fetish objects, I want to take you to conspiracies, right, which use also fetish objects. And here the work of another French anthropologist, Didier Fassin, who is more known on his work on humanitarianism, on humanitarian borders, but who has been writing a lot recently on conspiracy theories. So this piece called Of Plots and Men, he actually gave as the Eric Wolf lecture at the University of Vienna before the pandemic, so in 2019, very kind of prescient. Why does Fassin say conspiracies matter? As he writes, conspiracies imply a systematic search for the explanation of adversity. Things can't just happen by chance. A capacity for finding evidence, maybe not in the way we would look for evidence, right? So interpreting a variety of events. The existence of maleficent forces, the global elites that are forcing you to eat insects. So somebody is out there trying to manipulate fate. But also, this is important, the development of an accusatory system, right? Who is to blame? Where does responsibility lie? And so what Fassin argues, and I think this is really important for us, is that we should look at conspiracies not just as, kind of mad rantings, but as indexes of power. As he writes, they don't only belong to the realm of delusion. They are indexes of social relations, political tensions, cultural disquietude, and moral uneasiness. And Ella Drążkiewicz also and her team in Sweden have been doing a lot of work on this. I think she's got a new ERC project looking at this. And she writes about this in very similar ways. So looking at these stories, at these conspiratorial stories, visions of the world, as wars over power, but also wars over the right to inclusion. And again, I think this is really important. So I want to give you two examples. One, because it's very easy and because we're all so familiar with it from pandemic times, and one looking at the backlash against the Green Deal. And we'll come back to the insects and other fetish objects like gas stoves. And the reason I think the pandemic is still important to look at is because the groups that emerged in opposition to pandemic or various forms of pandemic governance are still with us today. They've just changed focus. But also because the pandemic revealed a lot of this disquietude and unease and attempts to make sense of it, of an event that was staggering in its portent. And so what I want to think about quite quickly is, how blame was mapped in a sense, and how, we cannot simply reduce, whether pandemic I shouldn't say pandemic backlash, but pandemic governance backlash, to just the role of disinformation. It's there, it's really important, but there is more. And if we reduce it to that, we miss the other bits. So all of you will be familiar with at least some of the COVID conspiracies. If you're not, talk to any Fiorentino taxi driver who will weave them all seamlessly. I once had, actually, my best one was a driver in Rome who I let take me for, I think it was like half an hour longer ride, because I wanted to hear how he was going to put together the City of London, the Pope, the Chinese, Big Pharma. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, for a geographer, kind of somebody who studies geopolitics, I wanted to bring him to class with me. Anyway, joking aside, you will all be familiar with at least some of these imaginaries. So whether it is, the role of corporate power, Big Pharma, global elites, plotting the New World Order, these, kind of biopolitical fears of demographic re-engineering, the depopulation vaccine, and so on. This is a picture taken in the Netherlands that features, I don't know if you can see the characters there, not just Dutch politicians, but also the very familiar face of George Soros, of course. He's got to be everywhere, got a conspiracy, let's, get him there. And the Netherlands was actually a fascinating place to watch some of these protests, because they were quite violent as well. But I think one of the things that's interesting is how, on the one hand, it was a process of sense-making by individuals and groups, but at the same time, the entry of other actors, economic actors, geopolitical actors, that took advantage of this moment of vertigo and disorientation. And the pandemic, and that's why I'm saying it's still very important to look at what emerges in that moment, because those groups, not just on the far right, also on the ecological left, and both of these came together, and a variety of other, I guess we could call them anti-systemic groups, are still very much with us. So, I'll show you, one thing here, sorry, I wanted to mention this idea of the merchants of doubt. It's a great short piece from the British Medical Journal. In the early months, this is from 2021, noting how those groups feeding pandemic disinformation were the exact same groups that were feeding climate change skepticism. So whether corporate actors, other actors feeding information flows. But back to, kind of the geopolitics of these conspiracies. I have some slides. It's good to remember these things. These are from a big demonstration in Berlin, and weather in Berlin. I spent some time in Austria, and it was staggering watching the weekly marches on the ring with, again, the FPÖ and other far-right groups and the far left. And the force with which, these ideas brought people to the streets. but once more with a very particular geopolitical also mapping, not just of the role of their state, but of other actors. As you also remember, there were slogans that circulated. This is from Berlin, "We are the people." This is a picture I took in Rome. This is Piazza della Bocca della Verità. This idea of we are the people, we are reclaiming our right to oppose the intervention of the state. And in here, kind of back to the role of distinct geographical imaginaries, this idea of individual sovereignty, and together with a colleague who's an EU lawyer, an EU constitutional lawyer, we wrote a couple of pieces kind of trying to understand this notion of individual sovereignty. I mean, what is it that these groups were attempting to claim? I mean, it's in many ways a contradiction, and happy to share this work with any of you, because these notions of sovereignty, asserting sovereignty, are returning in other forms of backlash. And the thing that was really interesting in the COVID protests is, they were protests against, vaccine mandates. But if you remember, a lot of the protests, including here in Italy, including in my hometown of Trieste, which became kind of the center point of some of these anti-pass discussions, in the opposition to the COVID pass, it's really interesting how blame was located. So if you remember, I mean, this is, the original EU communication, and Ursula von der Leyen did a tour of European capitals to, to present this initiative, with the magic pass allowing her, safe free movement. The blame was very much placed with national governments and even with the local state, right? Even though the initiative was a commission initiative. And so, we've written this time with another colleague in law, again, about, how people made sense of the enforcement of these certificates. I'm looking at the time, and I want to have time to talk about some other fetish objects. So just, one more point about these discussions is, kind of, again, making sense of this momentous, kind of moment of turmoil that was the pandemic, in every possible way, how people once more assigned also blame for, kind of the forms of kind of COVID governance that were attempted. But also, as I said, locating blame, but also support. I mean, think of that image, of this idea that, Mr. Putin is supporting our claims. And the reason I show you the Putin slide is because the very same groups, and together with a PhD student, we've been literally tracking the same actors, have moved seamlessly from anti-vax, anti-pass opposition into opposition to support for Ukraine. This is actually taken, again, in my hometown, which is for some reason a focal point of also some of these groups, with the slogan, NATO fights for peace, like, Pfizer fights or cares about your health. I mean, and the slogan in Italian was, guerra pandemia stessa strategia. So, war and pandemic, the same strategy of, global elites, European elites, to take advantage of ordinary people. And the tie, this is, again, from a manifestation last year, we're for peace, social justice, freedom, and against repression. This dates back still to COVID times. Rising costs, energy costs, living costs, and war. And the connection is made directly. But I want to come to more recent forms of backlash, which is the one that we all witnessed over the past months. I happened to be in Brussels when kind of the Molotovs were being tossed, but also in the Netherlands with some quite violent protests on the roads. And as you well know, a quite quick reaction from the Commission. Very disappointing, at least to my mind, with key pieces of the proposed legislation being either rolled back, suspended, rethought. So, these protests matter. This is not just, extreme fringes, even though, the farmers' protests are very hard to characterize as the extreme fringes. And here we come back to the insects, right? Because in making sense of the European Green Deal, the various policies that are being proposed to tackle climate change, in the previous panel, I think, Paul, you were making the point that it's very difficult for people to understand. And actually, these policies remain willingly hidden, right? So with the inability, and we were back to Therese Fetish, with the inability to understand carbon trading, to understand even the policies that are attempting to cut agricultural emissions, to, kind of transform, the use of even pesticides, which are a bit more kind of tangible. In the absence of, the ability to grasp what is happening, we seize upon fetish objects, whether it's, enforcing the eating of insects, cultivated meat. That's another. I didn't have a good picture of cultivated meat, or I would have showed you that. But the insect thing in the European elections really became, kind of this meme, certainly. I mean, and I have Italian examples. This is a very outspoken MEP from the Lega party. It was like, I'm going to always fight, for made in Italy, but especially, making sure that we don't, we're not forced to eat insects. His name is Angelo Ciocca. And the list here, I mean, think about the fetish objects that cover pretty much every policy realm that you guys have talked about. No war, no Islam, no electric cars, no insects, no greenhouses, so no ecological houses, and then, of course, no Ursula von der Leyen. So, and with Islam, also the cipher is no migration. And once more, we can smile, but all of these things, become quite important. This is again from the Atreu feed, so the youth organization that comes from Meloni's political wing. I had a nightmare. And I mean, the word nightmare here is important. I'll say in a second something about imagining futures and why it's important. I had a nightmare, electric cars became obligatory, which indeed, as you know, the elimination of combustion engines is on the agenda. One more example here for you, and I promise, Eric, I'm getting to the close here. Matteo Salvini saying, I'm defending the homes and cars of Italians. I mean, what is he doing? This is not a question, he's not defending them against robbers. I mean, that was the old Lega that worried about, kind of people are going to come and break into your house. No. What he's defending here when he says, I'm defending the homes and cars, is the right, to have a home heated with gas, with a gas stove, with whatever the hell you want to have in it as appliances, and the right to a petrol-powered car. Now, again, an example from across the Atlantic, because what is also important is that these movements, as I said, I've used Italian examples. I could give you very similar examples from other European contexts. Both the FPÖ and the AfD have had this obsession with electric cars, with eliminating gas stoves as well, in part with insects. These movements, these groups, I don't even want to call them movements anymore, these political forces speak to each other. The obsession with eliminating gas stoves has been a kind of fundamental part of, kind of the, not just the Trumpian Republicans, but much more widely. This is, this was the kind of slogan already last year, if you're going to take my gas stove, you're going to have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. I mean, referring, for those of you who know American politics, to taking away guns. But part of these imaginaries, it's not just, here it is, kind of the national, the global elites that want to take these things away from us is once more, and I stress this, the question of inequity, right? This is from Ted Cruz, who I usually wouldn't cite in a presentation, saying, these rules are for thee, but not for me, showing First Lady Joe Biden cooking on a gas stove, saying, why is it that, kind of the Biden White House is proposing that all of us, kind of take the step to eliminating gas stoves, and yet, and this question of inequity, not just, kind of feeling the brunt of economic policies, migration policies, climate mitigation policies, but the fact that we, the people, are forced to do this while the elites are not, is also very important to take into account. So this is once more from Atreu before the European elections. They had a whole series of this. This one just is fruttivendola, which is kind of greengrocer. There was one pescerola, carciofara, and so on, saying, here play on Meloni herself and her name, saying, maybe for you, the left, that has referred to her as, a shopkeeper, essentially. Maybe for you it's an offense, for us it's not. Stop the classism of the left and go vote. And, here we come to, I think, something that's really important. And I will close here because I think, once more, it is tempting to reduce, whether these forms of conspiratorial thinking or this, focalization on what Terry would call fetish objects as, as a form of misunderstanding of, what is happening, of, a very kind of banal way of making sense of crisis. Rather, and certainly, this is what I would try to argue, we really need to look at these forms of sense-making, this attempt to connect, and here, bringing back geography, global change, change at the level, of the EU to the everyday. These attempts at sense-making, we need to take them seriously. And we need to understand that they are also forms of class critique, they're forms of political-economic critique, cultural critique, that have to do with what is perceived to be an unequal present, but especially a very unequal future. And, Eric, you asked me to kind of be future-looking in the talk, so this is how I would like to end. And this time also with work from geography, from anthropology, on futuring and on future making, because I think it's really important. And I have to thank a PhD student of mine who introduced me to this literature that I was not aware of. And the person who started writing about this, already over a decade ago, is Arjuna Padurai, who talked about how the capacity to aspire, right, to imagine the future, to think about the future, is something that is quite unequal. And this capacity to aspire is very important because, again, it doesn't just imagine the present and the good life and our rights to it, but what we are going to be, what we are able to become. And according to Padurai, these imaginations of the future, of a good future, are, as he writes, shot through with affective imaginaries, right? But, this is what he stresses, the capacity to aspire is never evenly distributed in society. And this is, I think where I would like to close with a series actually of questions rather than solutions. So there are two urban scholars who've been writing about this extensively. So Sylvie Chakalalai and Julie Ren, and I'm sure I'm butchering their names. And what they've been looking at is actually looking at urban policies, kind of urban planning, noting how in imagining future cities, as they write, not everybody has the opportunity to imagine the future. And the future field itself, they argue, is crisscrossed by inequalities and imbalances. So not only, as Appadurai would say, do people have unequal ability to aspire for a better life, right? But the very act of, as they write, imagining, measuring, narrating the future shapes the inability of other actors to do that. So the policy choices, the ways of measuring, and I'm thinking about, some of the interventions, whether measuring the effects of climate change and responding to that, or other forms of intervention, right? That ability is already going to constrain the ability of others to imagine different futures. And this is being profoundly felt. So these calls, which may seem extreme, absurd, are also about claiming a capacity to aspire for a different future, which we may not share at all, right? Because it will be a future that is based on the closure of borders, on, exclusionary politics of all sorts, on continuing to emit as much as we wish to. But it is, it is a form of, of political aspiration that we need to take seriously. How to confront this, I don't have answers, but I think the plea that I would end with, and I don't know if this is, to feed into the next session of joint workshops, is, yes, to take these forms of backlash, if we want to take, kind of call them that much more seriously, even, as fetish focused as they may be. And I think I'm more or less on time, so I will end there. And thanks for bearing with me with this, yes, I think quite different form of storytelling about crisis. Thanks so much.